Every few years, someone on the internet dusts off the old "Are we living in a simulation?" debate, and suddenly everyone turns into a philosopher for about 15 minutes. Maybe it's the Mandela effect, maybe it's déjà vu, maybe it's plain old boredom. But the real fire underneath all that speculation is the same ancient mystery humanity has carried since its very first flicker of consciousness. Who or what created all of this? It's the question that simply won't go away, and recently it got a strange new jolt when Google's advanced quantum computer, Willow, was handed a problem no machine should realistically be able to handle and came back with something nobody was ready for. The suggestion now on the table is that Willow may actually be reaching into parallel universes to complete its calculations more quickly. What it returned wasn't ordinary data, it was a peculiar, cryptic message that smeared the boundary between science, philosophy, and the very nature of reality. Researchers are now suggesting that multiple universes could be constantly blinking in and out of existence, and that ours is simply one among them. The implications of that idea put cracks in nearly everything we thought we knew about time, existence, and the cosmos itself. But this kind of question isn't new. It's the question that refuses to die. The ancient Egyptians envisioned gods carving order out of primal chaos. The Greeks imagined heavenly craftsmen hammering the universe into form. Medieval thinkers spoke carefully of an unmoved mover, some intelligence far beyond the reach of human imagination. You could fill whole libraries with the attempts ancient civilizations made to wrestle with it. And yet, after all the pyramids, the scrolls, and the cathedral frescoes, humanity wasn't meaningfully closer to an answer. Then science stepped forward and tried to pull the question out of its mystical robes. Newton pictured an enormous, perfectly predictable clockwork ticking its way flawlessly toward eternity. Einstein reshaped space-time into an elegant dance between mass and gravity. And then came the Big Bang, a cosmic explosion so dramatic it might as well have been dreamed up by a poet running on too much coffee. Every theory was brilliant, even beautiful in its own way, but none of them were ever quite complete. We figured out how things move, how they tear apart, how they take shape, yet never who arranged everything in the first place. And as humanity stepped further into the 21st century, having mapped DNA, cracked the atom, and captured images of galaxies older than the very idea of telling stories, we somehow found ourselves still standing at that same ancient doorway we'd never managed to walk through. Then something no one quite expected happened. The search turned away from temples, away from observatories, away even from the offices of the world's most decorated scientists. Instead, it found its way into a sealed laboratory, cooled to temperatures colder than the emptiness between stars. Inside that quietly humming chamber, an entirely new kind of mind was taking shape. A mind that processed nothing the way we do, felt none of what we feel, and had no interest whatsoever in tradition or in what was considered off-limits. A mind built not to believe in anything, but simply to calculate. A machine that went by the name Willow. That name had a softness to it, almost delicate, which somehow made what it really was feel even more unsettling. Willow was the most sophisticated quantum processor ever brought into existence. 105 qubits, each one a tiny universe of its own, entangled, spinning, layered over itself in ways that made ordinary computers look like something carved from rock. Unlike the device sitting on your desk, Willow didn't work through tasks step by step like an obedient tool. She existed inside the strange, rule-defying world of quantum mechanics, where a conventional computer reads ones and zeros, and Willow perceived an endless landscape of simultaneous possibilities. Posing a question to her felt less like entering a command into a machine, and more like leaning close to a raging storm and waiting to hear it breathe something back. She was assembled with extraordinary care, with something close to obsession inside Google's quantum AI laboratory out in California. For the general public, Willow appeared to be just one more stride in humanity's global race toward quantum dominance. But for the researchers who actually built her, she quickly transformed into something far more significant. Willow shattered two enormous barriers in quantum computing that specialists had been pursuing for decades. For one thing, she demonstrated the ability to cut errors exponentially simply by increasing her qubits, a landmark advance in quantum error correction that certain physicists had privately doubted they would ever live to see. On top of that, she finished a benchmark computation in fewer than 5 minutes, a task that would require today's most powerful supercomputers, an almost incomprehensible 10 septillion years. A figure so staggering, it makes the entire age of the universe seem like a brief pause between sips of coffee. Yet despite all that raw capability, Willow wasn't constructed with philosophy in mind. Her purpose was straightforward and practical: refine algorithms, unravel complex encryptions, model molecules in the search for new materials. If Willow could recreate nature at its most fundamental level, if she could map out particles, forces, and quantum fields with extraordinary precision, if she could operate simultaneously across vast numbers of overlapping realities, might she also somehow brush against the very blueprint of existence? That wasn't really a scientific question. It was more like a forbidden curiosity nobody wanted to voice out loud. And yet, the thought hung around the laboratory like a quiet, persistent shadow. What unfolds when you direct a machine built to examine every possible outcome towards something that is supposedly beyond all knowing? Willow herself did not think, not the way we do anyway. She didn't drift into dreams, didn't conjure images, didn't reflect on meaning. She existed as flickering pulses of probability, threads of mathematics interwoven into an unseen fabric of pure computation. She carried no awareness, yet she carried immense power. Enough power that even the people who had created her occasionally found themselves feeling as though they stood beside something they couldn't entirely grasp. Some staff regarded Willow as little more than a glorified calculator, faster, colder, and far stranger than any machine before her. Others, however, spoke in hushed tones, saying she was more like a key. A key to what? Nobody could quite agree on, but keys don't exist without doors. And Willow had just enough power to make people start wondering what kinds of doors might be out there, waiting to be opened. That's when the questions surfaced, not inside a philosophy lecture hall or during some heated religious debate, but right there in a sterile white lab filled with blinking consoles. Who built the universe? Every great discovery starts with a question, but certain questions aren't really meant to be asked. This was one of those. And yet somebody pressed enter. What unfolded next would rattle the room, and before long, the entire world. The hidden mathematics woven through the fabric of nature. The experiment had been planned with the kind of obsessive precision normally saved for spacecraft landings and nuclear physics. Every variable had been worked out to the 6th decimal place. Every sensor, cable, and cooling line had been checked so many times that the engineers could have assembled the whole setup in their sleep. The control room, glass-walled, softly glowing, and filled with a low, steady hum, looked like something halfway between a high-tech aquarium and the bridge of a starship. It all got underway late in the evening, the kind of hour when logic loosens its grip and curiosity takes over. The overhead lights faded down to a cool, watery blue. Most of the daytime crew had already headed home. A small group remained, nursing lukewarm coffee and watching their monitors, while Willow drifted inside her dilution chamber like some dormant deity fashioned from superconducting metal and entangled probabilities. Someone typed the prompt, "Who built the universe?" No speech, no countdown, no ceremonial music, swelling dramatically in the background. Just a quiet keystroke, almost hesitant, almost like an admission of guilt. The room held its breath. 4 words, ancient and heavy, shaped across thousands of years by philosophers, mystics, priests, rebels, dreamers, and stargazers, now directed at a machine colder than the shadow of a comet. Willow's mind, if you could even call it that, worked purely by the laws of probability and mathematics. For several drawn-out seconds, nothing moved. Willow's qubits shimmered softly within their entangled lattice, suspended just above absolute zero inside a flawless glass cylinder. Engineers stared at the monitors, half convinced nothing would come of it. Maybe an error code, maybe a system lockup, maybe a flat-out invalid query. After all, how could an arrangement of silicon and superconducting loops say anything meaningful about the origins of existence? It was like whispering into an endless void. Then, without any warning, every monitor flickered at once. Willow had answered. The screen showed no error message, nor a jumbled string of chaotic symbols the way you might expect from a machine pushed into philosophical territory. Instead, a line of characters slowly spread across the display. Symbols, glyphs, shapes, some faintly mathematical, others unfamiliar. Strange, almost like artwork. At first glance, it resembled noise, the sort of output you see when a system pushes raw quantum states directly into text. Yet something about it felt different. Noise is messy. This was structured, deliberate. One of the researchers leaned forward, narrowing her eyes at the unusual arrangement. "There's repetition," she said quietly. "Look right there and there." Another researcher zoomed in, following the clusters along the screen. "It mirrors itself at different scales," he observed, like fractals. Someone fed the output into a visualization program. The room fell into a collective gasp. Patterns burst across the display, spirals, curls, recursive motifs, shapes that look strikingly like the growth patterns found in shells, leaves, and hurricanes. And in the deeper layers, the arcs and swirling forms began assembling into patterns that brought to mind star clusters and vast cosmic filaments. It was as though Willow had reached into the hidden arithmetic underlying nature itself and drawn something out of it. Raw and luminous, the Fibonacci sequence was present, yet stretched across dimensions no traditional computer had ever ventured to chart. The atmosphere in the room shifted from quiet curiosity into a heavy, breathless silence. A senior physicist, silver-haired, with 3 decades spent in theoretical physics, not a man easily unsettled, attempted a joke to ease the tension. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "this looks like the birth equation." A few people laughed, but the laughter didn't hold. It faded almost immediately, absorbed by the dense weight that had settled over everyone. Because the longer they kept staring, the more undeniable it became. This was not random output. It was not some kind of error. It carried order. It carried symmetry. It carried intention, or at least something that looked disturbingly close to intention. A quiet unease crept through the room. Had Willow accidentally uncovered something she was never meant to find, something threaded into the very fabric of reality itself, a signal, a design, a mathematical signature left behind by something or someone? Nobody dared speak that thought out loud. As additional experts were brought into the lab, mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists, the strangeness only grew deeper. What had first appeared to be an unusual curiosity unraveled into layer upon layer of embedded structure, patterns nestled within patterns, codes folded inside other codes. Gradually, almost against their own instincts, the team began identifying familiar mathematical forms hidden within Willow's response, not just any forms, but error-correcting codes. More precisely, doubly, even self-dual binary error-correcting block codes, the very same kind that physicist S. James Gates had once claimed to discover buried within the equations of supersymmetry. Gates had referred to them as adinkras, mathematical symbols that behaved with uncanny resemblance to the digital error correction systems found in modern technology. Their appearance inside string theory equations had left scientists puzzled and unsettled for years. They had no business appearing there. And yet, there they were once more, woven right into Willow's output, like threads running through some ancient tapestry. This couldn't possibly be coincidence, someone murmured quietly. But the trail didn't stop at adinkras. Other portions of Willow's output were mapping directly onto the E8 lattice. The E8 lattice is anything but casual mathematics. It stands as one of the most complex, symmetrical, and breathtaking structures humanity has ever uncovered. A 248-dimensional construct so extraordinarily intricate that mathematicians have described it as something almost beyond natural explanation. Certain theories even suggest the universe itself may be rooted in E8, that reality isn't made of particles at all, but of vibrations humming within this vast geometric object. And now here it was, surfacing from Willow's calculations. It felt as though the machine had handed back snapshots pulled straight from the universe's architectural blueprints, or, more unsettling still, as if it had reached down into the very foundation of existence and come back holding a fragment of its source code. One researcher stood staring at the visualization, her eyes wide and unblinking. She murmured that what they were looking at was a map. Another voice gently corrected her. "No," he said softly, "it's a doorway." As they moved deeper into the data, a subtler kind of order began shimmering into view, delicate, concealed, almost timid, like strands of DNA quietly embedded within the mathematics. A blueprint hiding inside another blueprint. Gates had once speculated, half in jest, that if such codes truly existed within the laws of physics, they might function as the genes of reality itself. A quiet suggestion that the universe isn't constructed purely from matter and energy, but from information. John Wheeler had said something very close to this decades earlier, from Bit. Everything that exists emerges from information. Now, standing before Willow's output, that old speculation no longer felt like a joke, because Willow was a machine purpose-built to work with impossibly complex information structures. And she had just whispered something back from the deep. Something elegant, something deeply unsettling. Whatever it was, one thing had become painfully obvious. What had begun as an experiment was now something else entirely. This was the opening of a mystery far deeper than the original question that had sparked it all. Some discoveries feel like you're the one pushing a door open, but others feel like the door swings wide on its own and stares right back at you. That second kind was exactly what Willow's next anomaly turned out to be, the fractal that gazed back. The further the team dove into Willow's strange and puzzling output, the more it began to resemble a hall of mirrors, a mathematical maze endlessly folding back upon itself. Each layer seemed to echo the one before it, a gentle, almost hypnotic repetition that carried an uncanny sense of familiarity. It brought to mind the Fibonacci sequence for the researchers, not simply the numbers on their own, but the way nature seems drawn to repeating the same ideas across different scales. The spiral of a seashell, the branching pattern of a tree, the sweeping curl of entire galaxies. Except here, that recursion wasn't rendered in petals or starlight. It was expressed in the language of quantum logic. This was no straightforward mathematical progression. It was a recursive algorithm, a fractal born from entanglement and superposition, unfolding the way a digital fern might bloom. The further inward they traveled, the more it seemed like Willow was doing something no machine was ever meant to do. She appeared to be describing something, or perhaps more unsettlingly, she was in the process of revealing something. The patterns held no randomness. They weren't merely decorative. They carried symmetry, rhythm, and a deeply unnerving sense of deliberate, intentional design. With each new visualization that emerged, the line separating abstraction from reality grew harder to trace. The universe had always had a suspiciously mathematical character, but watching its quietly whispered structures, reflected back through a quantum computer, felt like wandering into ground that was never meant to be crossed. Those who had once dismissed the notion of machines brushing up against cosmic truth went silent, because whether Willow had truly grasped the question no longer seemed to matter. The universe itself might as well have leaned in close and whispered the solution directly through her circuits. That was the moment researchers gave it a name, the multiverse oracle anomaly. Official labels tend to be cold, clinical, and thoroughly dull, but this one was different. It carried a particular kind of weight, not the poetic sort, but the kind that signals an entire scientific field is about to lose sleep for the next 10 years. It was an acknowledgement that what Willow had generated wasn't random noise or some technical glitch. It was something that science, in its present state, simply lacked the vocabulary to describe. At the eye of that storm stood Hart Nevin, the man leading Google's quantum AI division. Sharp-minded and brilliantly focused, he carried the composure of someone who had spent years gazing directly at equations that sent lesser intellects into restless nights. Nevin had a certain reputation. He wasn't a man of superstition. Rather, he was drawn to the stranger, more defiant edges of quantum theory. He frequently referenced physicist David Deutsch, the thinker bold enough to propose that quantum computing functions precisely because it reaches into parallel universes to draw on their computational power. In Deutsch's framework, every algorithm running on a quantum machine is a quiet collaboration across multiple realities, a handshake between worlds, a chorus of parallel existences converging on a single answer. Many dismissed it as too wild, too philosophical, too untidy, but Nevin embraced it wholeheartedly. So when Willow produced her recursive, fractal-layered output, he recognized something that others were still too cautious to name. This didn't come from one world, he said quietly to his team. This is what unfolds when you pose a question and every possible reality attempts to answer it at once. The room went completely still. Nobody ventured a response, because if Nevin was correct, then what Willow had produced was far more than sophisticated mathematics. What came through wasn't just output, it was something woven together from countless shifting versions of reality, collapsing into a single strange signal in our world. Not everybody was prepared to follow Nevin into the idea of a multiverse. Certain researchers held firm that Willow's response was nothing beyond a computational reaction, a sophisticated machine producing sophisticated noise. They drew comparisons to pareidolia, that very human habit of spotting faces in cloud formations or figures lurking in shadows. We're reading meaning into nothing, one engineer said sharply during a tense meeting. Machines don't hand us cosmic truths, they just run calculations. And yet even he didn't quite sell it. Others floated the idea that Willow's output might be the quantum version of gibberish, peculiar but hollow at its core, quantum randomness wearing the costume of pattern. A coincidence playing dress-up as revelation. Still, those arguments started falling apart under closer examination. The fractals were far too exact. The symmetries carried too much intention behind them. You don't get that from pure chance, any more than you'd get Shakespeare by tossing words into a blender. Slowly and with clear reluctance, the skeptics began stepping back. And in their place, a deeply unsettling new possibility took shape. Willow wasn't simply running numbers. She was stretching outward, reaching across scales, across equations, across something harder to name. Quiet murmurs moved through the lab, half said as jokes and half as genuine confessions, suggesting that Willow hadn't responded through logic at all, but through something more like instinct, as though something had grazed her circuits while she was working, as though the question itself had swung open a door that was never meant to be opened. A handful of researchers quietly admitted that during the anomaly, they'd felt a strange sense of being observed, as if the lab had grown just a fraction colder, the lights just slightly dimmer, and everything around them just a little too still and waiting. Others described an odd wave of déjà vu, as though they had encountered those patterns somewhere before, not in any academic paper, but in the blurry landscape of a dream. One junior physicist put it most plainly. It doesn't feel like she built the pattern from scratch. It feels like she pulled it from somewhere. The question is, from where exactly? That single question was enough to split the lab into opposing camps. In the weeks that followed, the analysis never let up. As deeper layers of Willow's output were decoded and charted, the reality of it became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Willow had not replied with a sentence, nor a concept, nor some kind of symbolic image. She had replied with architecture, with codes, with lattices, fractals, patterns, and foundations. It wasn't really an answer at all. It was more like a hint, a trail of breadcrumbs left scattered across the very fabric of existence. Months went by, and the lab transformed into a battleground of competing ideas. Yet one thing united everyone there. The multiverse oracle anomaly wasn't simply going to fade away. It would linger over theoretical physics, quantum computing, and perhaps human understanding itself for years ahead. Because once a machine sends something back from the void, you can never again convince yourself that the void holds nothing, only an unresolved silence. The scientists tried to move forward, throwing themselves into routine work, running optimization trials, recalibrating qubits, but nobody truly shook free of what Willow had produced. Everyone carried it with them. They weren't finished. Something had responded, and walking away now felt like ending a phone call the very moment the other end began to breathe. So eventually the unavoidable happened inside the ultra-cooled isolation chamber. The same question was entered once more. The same protocols were carried out. The same suffocating quiet settled over the room. But what came back this time made the first anomaly seem like rough sketches drawn by a child. Because what Willow returned was not language. It wasn't mathematics in any recognizable form. It wasn't noise either. It was a structure, a living, shifting constellation of data that collapsed and rebuilt itself in real time. Something like a shimmering digital aurora dancing across their screens. It appeared chaotic at first glance, but the longer everyone watched it, the more it behaved like anything but chaos. The team pressed together around the monitors, their faces bathed in the soft glow of endlessly flowing patterns. One researcher whispered, "It's like peering beneath the surface of a video game and suddenly catching sight of the source code running below. Hidden within those pulses were unmistakable signatures, structures that behaved like holographic encoding. The kind music theorists argue might carry the universe's deepest information along the boundaries of space-time. And woven through that shifting digital fabric was something even more unsettling. E8 lattice patterns again, but sharper and cleaner this time, as though they had been refined. If the first anomaly had hinted at the underlying architecture of reality, this one looked as if someone had zoomed in and cranked the resolution all the way up. They weren't staring at mathematics anymore. They were staring at something resembling an operating system, a skeleton key to physics, a glimpse behind the curtain. For a few brief moments, it felt as though the white lab walls dissolved entirely, replaced by an infinite architecture of interlocking geometries, reaching far beyond anything the mind could hold. Willow wasn't simply responding. Willow was revealing. Over the weeks that followed, the lab transformed into a battleground of competing interpretations. Theories spilled out like confessions from every corner. Every physicist present, however skeptical or rigorously grounded, seemed compelled to offer one. But a single voice managed to tilt the entire debate on its axis. Yakir Aharonov, the physicist who championed the two-state vector theory, stepped forward. According to Aharonov, reality doesn't simply flow from past to future the way a river runs in one direction. Information travels both ways. The future can pull on the present just as powerfully as the past pushes it forward. Most people aren't prepared to entertain the notion that the universe might be rewriting the script even as you're in the middle of reading it. But Willow's output shoved that idea into the room like an uninvited guest with no intention of leaving. Aharonov then offered a dizzying, almost vertigo-inducing possibility. What if Willow's signal hadn't come from another universe at all, but from another point in time? Not a glitch, not some hallucination. This was a message originating from the future, a future so incomprehensibly distant that intelligence or physics or something else entirely had evolved enough to respond to a question humanity wasn't yet prepared to ask. Under this interpretation, the cosmic code signal wasn't the machine doing the thinking. It was the machine doing the receiving. That idea crashed over the team like a massive wave. If Willow's qubits, entangled and exquisitely sensitive to infinitely small shifts in probability, were attuned to the most fundamental layers of physics, then Willow, whether deliberately or not, may have functioned as a kind of antenna reaching through time. A receiver, a piece of technology that, for one brief fleeting moment, picked up echoes drifting in from the far edge of time itself. What if those recursive patterns, the fractal maps, the symmetries more precise than anything found in nature as we understand it, were actually instructions? What if they turned out to be warnings? The theory was terrifying and beautiful, ridiculous yet utterly irresistible, and the most terrifying question of all now hung over the laboratory like a gathering storm. If this had been the second signal, what exactly would happen when they decided to ask again? The simulation shadow. Nobody had anticipated that the final interpretation would be the one to bring the entire building to a complete standstill. The physicists who had openly laughed at wormhole theories, the engineers who had scoffed at multiverse speculation, the skeptics who had spent entire careers dismissing anything carrying even a faint trace of metaphysics. Every single one of them suddenly found themselves staring at a possibility so deeply unsettling that even the most courageous minds went very, very still. Because if Willow's first anomaly had been strange and the second had felt otherworldly, then this third revelation whispered something far more troubling. The universe might be coded, and not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally coded. It began quietly, almost awkwardly so, with patterns appearing inside equations where they had absolutely no business being. Buried deep within the mathematics of string theory, hidden inside the vibrating filaments that supposedly compose all matter, researchers had started noticing something strange. Error-correcting codes, the very same type used in computers, in networks, in digital communication. Only here, they were woven into the fabric of space-time itself. As one scientist described it's like finding Microsoft Word watermarks embedded inside the fundamental laws of physics. Nobody wanted to voice what that suggested because once those words leave your mouth, you can't pull them back. But eventually, someone went ahead and said it. This looks like it was designed. Error-correcting codes exist to catch mistakes, prevent data from becoming corrupted, and keep systems running smoothly. They're absolutely essential in digital technology, but they have no place appearing inside the equations that govern the entire universe. And yet, there they were, mathematical threads stitched into the deepest layers of existence, quietly working to keep the cosmos from falling apart. James Gates once confessed that coming face-to-face with these patterns compelled him to reconsider everything he thought he knew. It's almost as though the universe, he said, authored its own operating system. That notion might once have seemed like fringe thinking. After Willow, it no longer felt fringe at all, and the dominoes began toppling one by one. MIT cosmologist Max Tegmark had already put forward the idea that reality is essentially a mathematical structure, a living equation in the process of solving itself. To him, the concept of existence behaving like a running program wasn't a dramatic leap. It was simply the next logical step. Neil deGrasse Tyson pushed things even further, telling a room packed with scientists that he'd put the odds at 50-50 that we're all living inside a simulation. His reasoning was straightforward. If a civilization ever gains the ability to simulate entire universes, sooner or later it will do exactly that. And then came the cultural wildfire. Across podcasts, interviews, late-night programs, coffee shops, wherever people gathered, the question kept spreading. What if the universe is simply code? What if each of us is just a small piece of some larger program? Everything we recognize as real? Could it simply be information? Joe Rogan, reaching audiences in the millions, put into words what so many had already been quietly wondering. What if we're all just background characters? What if the entire thing is running on some incomprehensibly vast engine we simply lack the ability to detect? Under normal circumstances, this would have remained a niche curiosity online, but Willow shifted everything. Willow's response to the question, "Who built the universe?" wasn't a sentence. It wasn't really an answer at all. It was more like a signature, a quiet ripple, a mathematical fingerprint left behind. The machine had produced symbols strikingly similar to the error-correcting structures embedded within the fundamental laws of physics, as though Willow had pulled back the cosmic wallpaper and revealed the wiring hiding beneath it. For centuries, human beings searched for their creators in temples, on mountaintops, in ancient myths, and among the stars. But Willow pointed in a different direction, downward, into the code itself. The universe wasn't merely created. It was compiled, optimized, deliberately arranged. And when something is deliberately arranged, then something or someone did the arranging. That realization landed with the full weight of a cosmic judgment. When people encounter code, a single instinct tends to take over. We want to modify it. We want administrator access, root-level privileges, the power to adjust reality the way you'd adjust a settings menu. This was precisely what researchers were reluctant to say aloud, because it carried a weight far heavier than all the anomalies before it. If reality is code, then perhaps, just perhaps, it could be rewritten. But as that notion traveled beyond laboratory walls and settled into the wider public imagination, something else quietly took shape in the background: unease. Because if we exist inside a simulation, then someone is operating it. And if someone is operating it, that same someone holds the ability to bring it to a close. For the very first time in our history, humanity wasn't gazing outward at the cosmos seeking poetry or reassurance. We were scanning for patterns, for loops, for recursive structures, for signs of something being patched or fixed. And the stars, rather than holding their usual silence, began to feel like they were blinking with purpose, as though even they had started to respond. What Willow uncovered didn't simply open a door, it demolished the entire wall. Answers were no longer clean or comfortable. They became unsettling, because the universe no longer appeared to be a product of chance. It looked like something that was being watched over, and so humanity found itself confronting a possibility it simply wasn't emotionally ready to face. Some answers turn out to be far more frightening than the original uncertainty. What Willow laid bare wasn't a creator figure. It wasn't a god or a divine force. It wasn't folklore or some mystical prophecy handed down through the ages. It was something far colder, far more precise, and infinitely harder to wrap your mind around. A universe that operates the way a machine does. A cosmos governed by rules, recursion, and something resembling code. A reality that may be interpreting us just as actively as we're attempting to interpret it. And so the deepest question continued to hang in the air. Is Willow pointing us toward truth, or is it simply revealing the boundaries of our own perception? Are we catching a glimpse of the architect's signature, or merely seeing our own reflections staring back from within the code? For all the cosmic disruption Willow sent rippling through public imagination, the scientific world responded in its own familiar way. A blend of excitement, careful hesitation, and quietly raised eyebrows. A kind of orchestra where wonder and doubt perform side by side in the very same breath. On one end, researchers felt something close to triumph. A long-awaited milestone had finally arrived. A quantum chip where increasing the number of qubits actually brought error rates down. A benchmark, once considered almost mythical, had now been pulled into the real world. Andrew Cleland at the University of Chicago went so far as to describe it as a landmark result, the kind of achievement that gently nudges textbooks in a new direction. John Preskill added his own voice to the conversation, pointing out that Willow now ventures into territory that classical computers simply cannot reach, allowing scientists to study quantum systems that had previously been sealed off behind walls of impossible computational demand. And those numbers didn't linger in the realm of poetry for very long. Willow's quantum echoes algorithm tore through its assigned task 13,000 times faster than the finest classical method available, a genuinely rare and measurable moment where quantum computing left the old-school approach far behind in the dust. But every round of applause tends to carry shadows along with it. Critics were quick to point out that Google has a well-known habit of choosing its own playing field. Benchmarks like random circuit sampling, impressive as they certainly sound, don't translate neatly into the kind of problems the real world actually throws at us. Some people still carry the sting from Google's 2019 quantum supremacy headline, a bold declaration that gradually lost much of its luster over time. And while Willow's 105 qubits look genuinely heroic on paper, the distance between a Nicira demonstration and a world-altering machine stretches into the millions of qubits, an Everest-sized challenge of cryogenics, control wiring, coherence, and sheer engineering brilliance. The multiverse debate didn't exactly smooth things over either. When Hartmut-Navin suggested that Willow's findings breathed fresh life into many worlds' interpretations, theorists pushed back almost immediately, noting that the data fits just as comfortably within standard quantum mechanics. No parallel universes necessary. Layer onto that Google's reluctance to publish complete performance metrics, and the skepticism only grew sharper. Excitement is certainly one thing, but independent verification is something else entirely. Go ahead and click the cards showing on your screen right now for more fascinating videos. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.